Hi, this is Morgan Walton, and this is my case study for, educational leadership. So to summarize the case, this case was really overwhelming for me because there seemed like so many red flags from the very beginning. So where it occurred, Rocket Junior High School. People involved, the assistant principal, Richard Inman, James, the student from the South Side, David Ramos, school police officer, and eventually the director of Secretary of Education, or Secondary Education. So overall, Mr. Inman has developed a strong relationship with James and his group of friends, which I think is amazing. And it really shows that since their grades have improved, they're mingling with other people, and James himself hadn't had a fight in months. It's amazing what a relationship can do when you build that with that student. It also involves David Ramos, who's an honor student who's never been in trouble in his life. He was seen receiving something from James in the hallway by another teacher. Mr. Inman was already discussing James's recent tardies for that week, so he was in the office. David arrived in the office with the police officer escort. And eventually it came out that James had handed David brass knuckles and told him he would beat him up if he didn't hold them for him until after school so he could take care of personal business. They were in the room at the same time. David refused to talk, so James mentioned everything that happened. David and James were both arrested because they both were in the wrong. They both had possession of the weapon, and they were both set to receive expulsion and consequences following the incident. Legal and ethical issues. David is receiving consequences for something that he did out of fear and did not act upon. So Mr. Inman really had a problem with this within himself. He really didn't feel like David needed to receive these consequences because he was told to do something for fear and through fear, and he held on to something for a bully. Mr. Inman may receive consequences of his own if he does not follow the policy set forth for him to follow in this case. If he does not fill out the expulsion forms for David, then he can receive an official reprimand in his personnel file from the director of secondary education. Ethics definitely competes with legality in this situation. Going against what he has to follow through the policy and comparing that with what he believes is ethically and morally correct is really tugging on him, and I can totally understand where that falls. Mr. Inman is not following the policy if he does not fill out the expulsion form for David, which means he's not doing what his contract states, which is why he could face the consequences such as an official reprimand. So to synthesize what happened in one sentence, it's a question for me. When should we as educational leaders put ethical decision-making ahead of policies and contracts? When do we decide what is morally and ethically correct and follow values that are set forth instead of just following the policy and our contracts that we are bound by? When do we make that decision of, well, we have to understand the students that we're dealing with, the parents that we're dealing with in the community, and when do we put those decision-making skills ahead of the paper that we signed when we took the position? So to synthesize the facts, the people that are involved, James has a definite history of behaviors, although Mr. Inman has worked very hard to decrease those behaviors. David does not have any incidences on his record, and Mr. Inman regrets his decision to include the school police officer, which I agree with. I would not have done things the way that he did in the first place, which I'll discuss later. Place, the school is of 900 students, so it's a large school in my opinion compared to the school district that I'm in. James is from the South Side, which Mr. Inman can relate to. And I'm assuming that it's an inner city school based on the size, which can change things with the community that they're involved with. Program, it's a public school. While this issue does not involve curriculum or specific programs, I think it's important to note that Mr. Inman has built a relationship with James and his group of friends, and that in itself has changed things for this situation. Review and prioritize. So the entire situation and decision could be damaging to stakeholders. Those within a very important stake in the outcome, Mr. Inman, James, and David. Mr. Inman could have an official reprimand in his record. He could not follow what he believes is right or wrong and do what he's told to do, and it could lead to some consequences for the students that maybe aren't necessary. James is already in the juvenile detention center, which is obviously going to affect him in his future, and David could receive those same consequences, which definitely would affect him in the future, as he hasn't had any prior issues. There are many pieces that I think are missing from this case, though. For example, why didn't the teacher approach the students during the exchange? If they saw the students exchanging something in the hallway and assumed that it was drugs, why didn't the teacher approach those students? Why were they just left to make the exchange and the teacher went to the assistant principal? That I definitely don't understand. Did James really make David take the brass knuckles? Or was it David or James taking the fall for David? I have to play devil's advocate and think maybe David wanted the brass knuckles and maybe James was giving them to him for a different reason. Maybe it's not what happened, is what James said. And I think it's important to look at both sides. Even if we don't believe it's true, it's definitely important to look at, because we need to think that both people could be at fault. And we definitely shouldn't judge James just because of his history. Maybe he was taking the fall for David. We don't know that. Does Mr. Inman really have to fill out the expulsion form for David? Is there a way around it? Is there someone that he could talk to? Is there someone that he could discuss things with to figure out if he really does have to fill this out? In my opinion, the situation is different for every situation. So does he really have to fill that form out for David, or is there a way around that? Identify the options and consequences. So what could I do? There's some questions that I had first. What further questions do I need to ask? Who could I approach and get some guidance? As the assistant principal, I think Mr. Inman needs to talk about things with his building principal. Maybe he needs to discuss things and get some advice. There's no reason why he can't consult other people on this. What policies do I need to confirm? Is the policy of filling out the expulsion form for David as well, is that a full policy that is confirmed and he actually must do, or is it something that he's expected to do even if it's not a policy? So the four options that I have based on the way that Mr. Inman handled this situation: fill out the expulsion form for both students, only fill out the form for James, not for David, retract the form for James and do not fill one out for David, and so neither of the students would have one filled out, or discuss the situation further with both students, not involving the school police officer. I think that is a very important piece where Mr. Inman probably messed up from the beginning. So the pros and cons. If he fills them out for both students, he's following the policy, he's doing what he's supposed to do. But is it ethically right? Do both students deserve expulsion? Do both students need to have those consequences? If he only fills it out for James, then James has consequences and David gets off the hook for not initiating the exchange as far as we know. The cons would be not following policy, and James may take the fall for the entire situation if that's not exactly what happened. Retracting the form for James and not fill one out for David. Both of the students would avoid expulsion and consequences, as we know the situation. And the cons, Mr. Inman would not be following policy, and no one has consequences for the situation. This option I definitely don't agree with, but we have to consider everything. Discuss the situation further with both students. the full truth may come out. If what James stated was not true, then the full truth may come out. Students may not have long-lasting consequences, although I do believe that consequences are still necessary. No one may have full consequences is a con, and definitely another con is that Mr. Inman would not be following policy. Choose the best option. After reviewing the case and the pros and cons, if I were this administrator in this situation, I probably would have talked with the students separately to begin with. The whole situation probably would have been different. I obviously can't say because I was not in there, but I believe that I would have handled it differently from the beginning. First of all, I would not have placed both students together to discuss the situation. I would have talked with them separately. And I also would not have included the police officer because knowing that David's history, it was very intimidating for him to have the police officer there. And I don't feel that he was able to speak what he needed to speak because of that. If I had to choose between the 4 options I stated, and if it went the way that Mr. Inman handled it, I would talk with the students again separately without the school police officer. And I would probably include the building principal in these discussions. 1, for guidance and advice, and 2, because overall it is that building principal's building, and the decision that I would be making would affect him in the long run. Ethics and values. Overall, I believe I would have handled the situation differently from the very beginning. I do not feel that it was handled properly by Mr. Inman. I think he got swept up in the situation and just followed what he thought at the time to be right, although I don't believe it was correct. It seems as though he may have set himself up to fail in this case from the very beginning, not purposely, but by including the school police officer and by speaking with the students together. I don't think he's getting the full truth. So when do we put the policy aside and take actions based on ethics, morals, and values? That's the overall piece that I gained from this case study. You're pulled both directions, but we have to follow, sometimes we have to follow our gut. And the situation is not going to be very simple, and you're not going to be able to discuss everything very easily with students all the time. So it's probably going to be a long situation where you're going to have to handle things over time. Thank you.